My name is Richard Hale, and for more than 50 years I've carried the weight of something I was never supposed to talk about. For decades, I tried to convince myself that silence would keep me safe, that if I never spoke the words, the memories would rot quietly inside me until time buried them for good. But time doesn't bury everything. Some things claw their way out no matter how deep you push them down. I can still feel the sour heat of its breath against my neck. I can still hear the uneven footsteps shuffling closer in the dark. And when I stand in front of the bathroom mirror every morning, I don't see my own tired eyes staring back, I see his. My son was the one who finally convinced me to tell this story. He said writing it down might help me sleep. I don't know if it will, but at least the truth won't die with me. The official story is simple. Back in the summer of 1971, Stanford University conducted a psychological study on prison life. Volunteers were assigned roles as guards or prisoners. Things supposedly got out of hand, and the experiment was shut down after 6 days. That's what the public was told. That's what went into the textbooks. But the truth was darker than anyone outside those basement walls could imagine. It wasn't just the cruelty of students playing guards. It wasn't just professors pushing boundaries. There was something else in that place, something that fed on us. And I learned, too late, that once it marked you, it never let you go. It began with an ad in the newspaper. $15 a day was a fortune to me back then, almost $1,300 in today's money. I was a 20-year-old English major with more overdue bills than ambition. And that ad looked like a golden ticket. A friend had done a similar study months earlier. He said it was easy cash, answer some questions, hang around campus, walk away richer. No risks, no pain. I figured it'd be the same for me. Maybe even fun. They brought me in for psychological testing. A thin man with sharp glasses asked endless questions about anger, nightmares, childhood traumas. I shrugged most of them off. The worst I'd ever done was throw a punch at a drunk who spilled beer on me at a concert. He scribbled notes, nodded, and finally told me I'd been approved. That was it. A handshake. A promise I'd hear back soon. And I walked away thinking I'd just scored 2 weeks of easy money. The first day didn't arrive the way I expected. It was a Sunday morning in mid-August. I'd stayed up too late, slept too hard, and was still tangled in sheets when the sound of sirens ripped through my apartment. Before I could get out of bed, 2 police officers stormed in, shoved me against the wall, and clamped cold metal cuffs around my wrists. I knew, logically, this had to be the experiment starting. But logic doesn't stop your chest from tightening or your pulse from exploding. They accused me of armed robbery, dragged me outside barefoot, and threw me into the back of a squad car. They drove me to the station, booked me, fingerprinted me with the kind of efficiency that made me forget this was staged. Then they pulled a blindfold over my eyes. And that's when fear turned real. I sat in silence, breathing through the stale fabric. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My wrists throbbed against the cuffs. Then I heard it. The door creaked open. The footsteps that followed were wrong. Too heavy. Too uneven. Like someone dragging one leg. And the breathing wet. Ragged. Inhuman. It moved closer until I could feel it pressing against me in the dark. Come with me, boy. A voice rasped. I froze. My mouth went dry. That wasn't an officer. That wasn't a student. Whatever stood in front of me, it wasn't right. Then, from down the hall, another voice called out. Human. Calm. This the last one. All present and correct. The rasp answered. Hands shoved me forward. I stumbled, caught between fear and confusion. As they pushed me into another car, I felt the shoulder of someone next to me. I whispered, do you know what? Shut the hell up if you know what's good for you. The driver barked. I shut up. When they finally yanked the blindfold off, I was standing in a blindingly bright corridor. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and merciless. 2 guards flanked me, their faces hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. They stripped me naked, searched me, then sprayed me with a chemical mist that stung my eyes and seared my lungs. My skin crawled with it. They handed me a thin hospital gown and a nylon cap for my hair. By the time they shoved me forward, I didn't feel like a student anymore. I felt like livestock. They gave me a number, 503. That was who I was now. Not Richard. Not a person. Just 503. They shoved me into a small cell with two others. I only knew them as 724 and 611. The room was barely big enough for 3 cots. The air thick with sweat and fear. I claimed the cot farthest from the door. But no distance was enough to quiet the memory of that rasping breath. The way it had pressed close to me in the holding cell. That night, I tried to sleep. There were no clocks. No windows. Just endless buzzing lights and the sound of guards' boots outside. I must have drifted off. Because the sound that woke me still lives inside me to this day. The door creaked open. I kept my eyes half closed. Heart pounding. The uneven footsteps shuffled closer. The wet rasp filled the room. It stood over 724's cot. At first, it looked like a guard. Same uniform. Same glasses. But then its jaw split down the middle. The skin peeled apart like paper tearing. From deep in its throat, a fat forked tongue slithered out, glistening in the light. It bent over 724. The tongue dragged across his arm before plunging into his ear. 724's eyes snapped open. His pupils shrank to pinpricks. His mouth opened in a silent scream. I wanted to shout, to move, to do anything, but terror pinned me to the mattress. Then, just as suddenly, the door at the end of the hall opened. The thing straightened, jaw snapping back into place. Face once again human. It walked out, locked the door behind it, and was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay awake until morning, my body aching from tension, my mind clawing for an explanation. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe the stress of being stripped, sprayed, and locked up had triggered some nightmare. But when I looked at 724 across the cell, I knew it hadn't been a dream. His skin was pale, slick with sweat. He stared at the ceiling like a man waiting for the sky to collapse on him. Every now and then, his arm twitched, like he could still feel that thing's tongue sliding across it. By the time the guards banged on the bars for morning count, none of us had slept. Daylight brought no relief. The guards barked orders, their mirrored glasses hiding their eyes. They controlled when we stood, when we sat, when we ate. The food was barely edible powdered eggs, stale bread, water that tasted of rust. Talking was discouraged, punished with shouts and shoves. But the fear of that thing that was worse than hunger or exhaustion. I caught 611 staring at me, his lips tight. He'd seen it too. I was sure of it. But neither of us dared speak. The silence in that place was thicker than the walls. That night, when the lights dimmed and the corridor fell quiet, I made my decision. I wasn't going to let it happen again. Help me, I whispered to 611, barely moving my lips. He hesitated, then nodded. We tore our identification numbers from our gowns. A small act of rebellion. Then we dragged our cots across the floor and wedged them against the cell door. It wasn't much than mattresses and weak frames, but it was all we had. Down the hall, I heard the scrape of beds against metal. The others were doing the same. Wordless. Desperate. United. When the footsteps came in the night, they stopped at our barricaded door. I held my breath. A silence stretched. So long I thought my heart might stop. Then the steps moved on. We'd won. At least. For a few hours. The next morning, the guards discovered our defiance. They shouted, cursed, rattled the bars. We jeered at them from behind our makeshift barricade. For the first time, I felt something like power. But then he appeared, at the back of the line of guards. Striding with casual authority, was the same figure from the night before. Only now, he looked fully human. The same uniform, the same mirrored sunglasses, the same smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The others called him officer. They treated him like one of their own. But I knew better. He lingered at the cell door, pulling down his glasses just enough for me to see his eyes. They weren't human eyes. They reflected, like mirrors, cold, merciless, amused. He winked, like he knew something I didn't. Then he walked away. My blood turned to ice. The guards returned within the hour, this time with reinforcements. We pressed our weight against the barricade, shoving back as they tried to force their way in. For a moment, it seemed like we might hold. But then the one I would come to know as John Wayne picked up a fire extinguisher. He unleashed a blast of carbon dioxide through the bars. The white cloud burned my lungs, stung my eyes, filled my throat with acid. I gagged and choked, collapsing to the back of the cell. The barricade fell. The guards surged in, swinging batons. One slammed me against the wall. My head rang. My vision blurred. Then John Wayne pressed close, his rancid breath hot on my cheek. His hand tore at my gown, pinning me in place. "This was always going to be tough," he whispered. "But it'll be tougher if you're stupid." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. That was the moment he became something more than a monster. He became a tormentor with a name. John Wayne. The name had once meant Saturday matinees with my father, cowboys and justice, the good guy riding into the sunset. Now it was poison. From that day on, John Wayne meant only cruelty. The punishment didn't stop there. As ringleaders of the rebellion, 724 and I were dragged to solitary confinement. The cell was no bigger than a closet, walls pressing in on all sides. I could hear him sobbing in the dark, fists pounding the plaster until his knuckles split. At first, I thought it was grief, or fear, or rage. But then I saw his eyes when they finally let us out. They shimmered like mirrors. Not a metaphor, not exhaustion, not madness. They were reflective, cold, inhuman, just like John Wayne's. Something had infected him. The guards took him to see the doctor overseeing the study. Of course, John Wayne went too. I can only imagine what happened behind that closed door. Because when they brought 724 back, he was broken. He sat in the corner, rocking, whispering to himself, "You can't leave. You can't quit. You can't leave. You can't quit." Over and over. His voice cracked. His fingernails tore at his skin. But his eyes never blinked. Always staring at me, gleaming with that mirrored light. That evening, his whispers turned to screams. He clawed at his own arms, tearing strips of flesh, shrieking until the guards dragged him away. I never saw him again. After that, the experiment changed. The prisoners who hadn't joined our rebellion were rewarded. They got clean uniforms, real beds, even the chance to shower. They strutted past our cells, smug in their privilege, while the rest of us stewed in filth. I hated them. But when I saw John Wayne walking with them, smiling, hand on their shoulders, I almost pitied them. They weren't privileged. They were his pets. That night, as the lights dimmed, the guards returned. Our cell door opened. One of them clubbed me in the mouth before I could move. Blood filled my mouth, dripping down my chin. They beat us without a word, their faces blank, mechanical. And through it all, John Wayne stood outside the bars, smirking. When they finished with us, they moved on to the next cell. I lay gasping on the floor, ribs aching, while the sounds of fists and screams echoed down the hall. Then I heard something worse. The screams from the third cell, the privileged cell, were different. 1, 2, 3 voices, each cut short. Over the wet sound of meat being torn, I realized John Wayne wasn't watching anymore. He was feeding. I blacked out. And I woke the next morning. My skull pounded like it had been split open. My lips were swollen, my ribs sore, every joint screaming. The guards yanked us from our cells for morning count. The routine was mechanical. Line up, hands behind backs, eyes down. I scanned the faces around me. But 724 was gone. In his place stood a new prisoner. Another volunteer with a new number stitched to his gown. No explanation. No questions allowed. 724 had simply ceased to exist. But I hadn't forgotten. His mirrored eyes haunted me more than his screams. The so-called privileged prisoners emerged next. The night before, I had heard their final cries as John Wayne fed. Yet here they were, shuffling out of their cell, draped in clean uniforms. Their faces, once proud, were gaunt and gray. Their movements lacked the fluidity of life. They were husks, empty vessels. John Wayne guided them down the corridor with a mocking grin. "I think you boys have served your time," he said, patting one on the shoulder. "Nothing but the high life from here on out." The husks didn't respond. They moved like puppets, eyes hidden beneath lowered lids. But when one glanced at me, I caught the glint of mirrored light. They were his now. The day shift found new ways to torment us. Instead of beatings, they forced us into endless exercise. Push-ups, jumping jacks, sit-ups, squats until muscles screamed and sweat pooled on the concrete floor. Whenever one of us collapsed, a boot dug into ribs and a single word followed. More? Their faces never changed. Blank. Expressionless. As if they weren't people anymore. Just extensions of John Wayne. When it finally ended, they dragged us back into our cells. My arms trembled, legs threatening to give out. I collapsed onto my cot, body shaking with exhaustion. Then John Wayne's voice cut through the corridor. Visiting day? Gentlemen, time to see your families. My stomach dropped. Families? Here? Before we could see them, the guards scrubbed us clean. They shaved our stubble, covered our bruises with long sleeves, even washed the blood crust from our faces. It was a grotesque parody of care. And when it was my turn, John Wayne himself stepped forward, razor in hand. I tried to back away, but two guards pinned me to the wall. Now, he crooned. I'm just trying to make you pretty for your folks. His hand cupped the back of my neck. He sponged my face with gentle strokes, almost tender. Then he leaned close, his breath rancid against my ear. If you decide to tell them about me, he whispered, I'll show you what else we can do with this razor. He pressed the blade against my throat, just hard enough to draw a pinprick of blood. My pulse hammered beneath it. You understand me, boy? I nodded, swallowing hard. Good. He smiled, cleaned the razor on my sleeve, and moved on. When it was finally our turn, I nearly wept at the sight of my parents. My mother's arms wrapped around me, her tears soaking into the borrowed shirt. My father clasped my shoulder with the firm grip I'd known all my life. It felt like salvation, like maybe this nightmare could end if I just held on to them long enough. But John Wayne was there, hovering, smirk never leaving his face. What's the matter with your boy? He asked my mother. Doesn't he sleep well? She flinched. He looks so thin. He looks. Of course he can handle it. My father cut in, pride bristling. He's a tough kid. A leader. He'll be fine. John Wayne chuckled. That's the spirit. I wanted to scream, to beg them not to leave me. But the razor's memory burned against my throat. I forced a smile, told them I was fine, and watched them walk away. As soon as the guards led me back to my cell, I collapsed into sobs. Through the blur of tears, I looked across the hall into the privileged cell. The husks inside stood still as statues, their mirrored eyes fixed on me. I knew then, the families couldn't see it. Whatever infection was spreading in that basement, it hid itself when outsiders were present. But we saw it. We lived it. And we couldn't escape it. That night, I lay awake, every nerve on edge. The corridor echoed with boots as the night shift came on duty. John Wayne among them. Of course, did he ever rest? He glanced into our cell, lips curling. Without a word, he nodded. The guards rushed in. A billy club cracked against my jaw. I hit the floor, dazed, while boots hammered my ribs. Blood filled my mouth. Around me, my cellmates cried out under the assault. But the guards never spoke. Their faces remained blank, robotic, as if their humanity had been drained. And through it all, John Wayne watched. When the beating ended, I barely had strength to lift my head. Across the hall, I saw them move to the next cell. Screams echoed. Flesh struck again and again. Then silence. The privileged cell door opened. John Wayne stepped inside. The screams that followed weren't beatings. They were feeding. Wet, tearing sounds. Cries that cut short like voices snuffed out mid-breath. 1, 2, 3. Then nothing. I closed my eyes, prayed for unconsciousness, and let darkness take me. Morning came like a cruel joke. I woke to guards dragging us from our cells again. My face throbbed, my body battered. But worse than the pain was the sight that awaited me. The privileged prisoners, those who had survived the night, emerged from their cell. They looked worse than before, gaunt shadows of themselves. Their eyes shimmered with mirrored light. They had become his. John Wayne herded them into place, his grin wide, Nothing but the high life. Boys, he mocked. Nothing but the high life. I clenched my fists until my nails cut my palms. I hated him. Hated him with every ounce of my being. But there was nothing I could do. Nothing any of us could do. We were trapped in his playground. And he wasn't finished with us yet. By the fourth day, I had learned something crucial about that basement. Pain was predictable, but fear was not. The guards had a rhythm. Mornings meant exercise until collapse. Afternoons meant silence broken only by the rattle of keys. Evenings meant darkness thick enough to choke on. But John Wayne didn't follow patterns. He prowled when he pleased, appeared when least expected, and every moment carried the dread that he might return. I woke that morning to find my cellmates standing stiff at the bars. They weren't waiting for Count. They were waiting for him. And sure enough, there he was. John Wayne stood in the corridor, face twisted in fury. His mirrored eyes flashed under the dim lights, veins bulging at his neck. "I've heard a rumor," he shouted, voice echoing down the block, "that some of you maggots think you're planning a breakout." No one spoke. "You piss in my face by even thinking of it." Spit flew from his mouth, frothing at the corners. "And when you piss in my face, I piss right back in yours." He snapped his fingers. Guards filed into each cell, lifting the buckets we'd been forced to use as toilets. The stench was overwhelming. My stomach lurched as one was swung forward, splashing its contents across my chest. The filth drenched me, clung to my skin. I gagged, fighting to keep down what little food I'd eaten in days. "Look at you," John Wayne sneered. "Animals wallowing in your own filth. And I know who's to blame." He turned, locking his mirrored gaze on me. "Prisoner 503. My breath caught. My heart hammered. I hadn't plotted anything. I hadn't even spoken of escape since the rebellion. But the truth didn't matter. He'd chosen me. A chant began, low at first, then swelling. "Prisoner 503 is a bad prisoner. Because of what 503 did. My cell is a mess. Mr. Correctional Officer." The voices came from every direction. Even my own cellmates turned on me, their eyes glinting with mirrored light. "Prisoner 503 is a bad prisoner." I backed against the wall, hands raised as if I could ward them off. But there was no refuge. John Wayne stepped inside the cell. He slammed his arm across my throat, pinning me against the concrete. His forked tongue slithered from his split jaw, writhing in the air. The chant thundered around me. Relentless, merciless. "Prisoner 503 is a bad prisoner." The tongue pressed against my cheek, slid along my lips, pried at the corners of my mouth. I screamed as it forced its way inside, the rancid taste flooding my throat. My vision darkened. My body convulsed. And then, nothing. I woke in a chair, gasping. The harsh light of an office seared my eyes. Across from me sat a man in a suit, his hands folded calmly on the desk. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." My body trembled. My mouth opened to scream. But then I saw his eyes. Normal. Human. "My name is Dr. Howard," he said. "You're not prisoner 503. You're Richard Hale. You're a student volunteer. And this is not a prison, it's an experiment. Those are students, not guards. This is Stanford University." Relief poured through me. Dizzying. I was free. It was over. He helped me to my feet, guided me out of the office, and into the sunlight. The warmth of the afternoon hit me like a drug. I could breathe again. He pressed a check into my hand. "For your time," he said. "And one more thing, you must never speak of what happened here. For your sake, and for ours." I nodded, too shaken to argue. The experiment, I was told, ended the next day. But freedom was an illusion. The nightmares began immediately. Night after night, I woke drenched in sweat, convinced John Wayne was standing at the foot of my bed. I moved back in with my parents, dropped out of college, tried to build a quiet life. And yet the past never loosened its grip. Sometimes, in crowded places, I'd catch a glimpse of mirrored eyes watching me from across the street. Sometimes, when the house was dark, I'd hear uneven footsteps shuffling down the hall. And every morning, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see Richard Hale. I saw him, The story could have ended there. A nightmare from my youth, locked away with the dust of old newspaper clippings. But it didn't, because John Wayne never left me. The mirrored eyes remind me daily. The breath at my neck reminds me nightly. And I know that somewhere, in some forgotten basement, he's still feeding. That was only the beginning of day 4. John Wayne wasn't finished with me yet. Because even after they pulled me out, I realized something horrifying. The others hadn't been released. The others were still down there. When I came to again, I wasn't in the sunlight anymore. That glimpse of freedom had been a trick. A cruel joke. I was back in the basement. The cell bars loomed in front of me. My number 503 stitched into the sleeve of my gown. My heart pounded as realization hit. I'd never really left. Whatever office, whatever doctor I thought I'd seen, that had been another layer of the torment. John Wayne hadn't finished with me. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of exhaustion and terror. The guards stripped us of food, water, dignity. Sleep came in jagged fragments, always shattered by boots pounding the corridor or the hiss of keys and locks. But it wasn't the guards I feared most. It was him. He appeared at random, his mirrored eyes glinting under the fluorescence, his smirk curling as if he savored our suffering. Sometimes he spoke, taunting us with promises of freedom we knew were lies. Sometimes he said nothing, just stood outside the bars until silence itself became unbearable. And always, he watched me more closely than the rest. One evening, as the lights dimmed, he stepped into the corridor with a new cruelty in his stride. "Prisoner 503, he called. His voice echoed, low and sharp. "Step forward." My legs shook, but I obeyed. The guards yanked me out, dragging me down the hall. The other prisoners whispered behind me, their voices chanting that same cursed refrain. "Prisoner 503 is a bad prisoner." It was as if the chant itself carried power, rooting into my skull, convincing me that maybe it was true that I was to blame. The guards threw me into a solitary cell, slamming the door shut. Darkness swallowed me whole. For what felt like hours, I heard nothing but my own breath. Then came the sound I dreaded most, uneven footsteps. He was here. The cell door creaked open, and John Wayne entered. His form shifted in the shadows, jaw splitting wide, forked tongue writhing. The mirrored eyes glowed faintly, reflecting even in the dark. "You'll never leave me," he hissed, his tongue slithering across my cheek. "You're mine, boy. Mine and mine alone." I tried to scream, but his tongue forced its way into my mouth, down my throat, choking me. My vision spun, black dots filling my eyes. I thought I would die there, consumed from the inside. And then just as before, I awoke somewhere else. This time, it was an office again. Bright light, clean air, a man in a suit smiling gently across the desk. "It's okay," he soothed. "You're Richard Hale. You're safe. This is Stanford University. The experiment is over." Relief surged, but it was poisoned with doubt. I'd been here before. I'd heard these words before. Still, I nodded, desperate for hope. He handed me a check, just as last time. He told me never to speak of what I'd seen, just as last time. He led me outside into the sunlight, just as last time. But this time, I didn't feel free. I felt watched. The experiment was officially declared over. The other volunteers, they said, had been released. The university spun a story about psychological stress, about how students had gotten too wrapped in their roles. But I knew better. I never saw 724 again. I never saw 611 again. The privileged prisoners were gone. The guards, those students, vanished back into their studies, their lives, as if nothing had happened. And me? I went home. I dropped out of school. I tried to stitch together a normal life. But normal is impossible when your nights are filled with rasping breaths and mirrored eyes. The first nightmare came that very week. I woke drenched in sweat, gasping, convinced I was back in the cell. I staggered to the bathroom, turned on the light, splashed water on my face. Then I looked up. In the mirror, my eyes shimmered. Not fully. Not yet, but just for an instant. They caught the light the way his had. Reflective. Inhuman. I stumbled back, heart pounding, telling myself it was imagination. But the image burned into me. He hadn't let me go. Years passed. I found work. Married. Raised children. I told myself I'd escaped. But shadows don't die so easily. Sometimes, walking home at night, I'd hear footsteps behind minivan. Dragging. I'd whirl around. But the street would be empty. Sometimes, in crowded places, I'd catch the glint of mirrored eyes across the room. By the time I blinked, they'd be gone. Sometimes, alone in the dark, I'd feel hot breath at my neck. I'd whisper his name, hating myself for giving it power, John Wayne. The older I grew, the heavier the weight became. I tried to bury it under work, family, years. But silence was its own prison. Now, half a century later, the memories are as vivid as the day they happened. My son told me to write it down, to finally let the truth out. He thinks it will help me heal. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. But I know this. What happened in that Stanford basement wasn't just an experiment. It was a feeding ground. And we were the cattle. That basement is long sealed. The professors retired. The textbooks written. The world remembers a failed study. A strange footnote in psychology. But I remember something else. I remember mirrored eyes. I remember the rasp of breath in the dark. And I remember his promise. You'll never leave me. Even now, as I write these words, I feel him here. The room is still, but the back of my neck prickles. My reflection stares too long, as though someone else is looking out through my eyes. And I know the truth. I never left that basement. Not really. I've been his all along. If you've listened this far, then you know my truth. But now I want to hear yours. What do you believe about violence and injustice? Do you think cruelty is born from power, or does it come from something darker? Something we can't name? Tell me in the comments. Share your thoughts, your beliefs, your fears. Because maybe, just maybe, if we speak together, the shadows won't win.